My fiancé vanished on our wedding day, and I discovered I was his financial strategy, not his plan to build a family with. Imagine standing in your wedding dress moments from walking down the aisle, only for your entire future to detonate with a single brutal text message. The shock of it hit me like a physical blow, ripping away the fairy tale and leaving behind a raw, burning fury. My wedding day started with a deceptive calm. I was tucked away in a brightly lit dressing room at the venue, half sipped into my gown as my best friend, Sarah, painstakingly curled a stray piece of hair. The air was thick with nervous excitement, a quiet hum that somehow made the impending disaster even more jarring. Then my phone buzzed. My first thought? My mom, probably already complaining about parking or the hors d'oeuvres. I chuckled, reaching for it, ready with a witty remark about her never letting me have a peaceful moment. But the second my thumb swiped open that message, the laugh died in my throat. It felt like an invisible hand clamped around my windpipe. The text from Justin, my fiance, was brutally brief. No emojis, no fluffy apologies, just a handful of words that slammed into my chest. He wrote that he couldn't do it, that he wasn't coming, that he was sorry, and that it was better this way. He hoped I'd understand. That was it. Years of my life, months of meticulous planning, loans, deposits, endless family drama, all reduced to a few pathetic lines. It sounded like he was canceling a dinner reservation, not our entire future. For a split second, I honestly thought it was a sick prank. That Justin would burst in with a camera crew, yelling, "Surprise!" because there was no universe where the man who told me he loved me just last night would cancel our wedding by text 40 minutes before the ceremony. I must have reread that message 10 times, the words blurring and sliding across the screen. My hands started shaking so violently I had to collapse onto a chair before my knees gave out completely. Sarah kept asking what was wrong, but my mouth refused to cooperate. My brain, in some twisted self preservation mechanism, started fixating on irrelevant details. A chipped nail, a loose thread on my dress. My entire world was imploding in slow motion, yet my body refused to catch up. I could hear guests laughing in the hall, soft music drifting in, someone dropping a tray in the kitchen and swearing. All the normal sounds of a perfectly normal wedding day, while my phone screen screamed that absolutely nothing was normal anymore. When I finally managed to vocalize it, my voice was so flat, so devoid of emotion that Sarah thought I was joking. "He's not coming," I whispered. He canceled. The wedding's off. She just stared, the curling iron still suspended midair, like I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. She had to see the message herself, needed physical proof that anyone could be that cruel, and as she read it, her face transformed. Her eyes filled with this gut wrenching mix of rage and pity. Honestly, the absolute worst combination to receive when you're in a white dress with mascara already threatening to betray you. She knelt in front of me, murmuring, "We'll figure it out, Chloe. We can still breathe. Don't do anything dramatic." Which, of course, immediately sent my mind spiraling down every dramatic rabbit hole imaginable. Now, this is usually the part of the story where a sensible person quietly cancels everything, goes home, cries into a tub of ice cream, and schedules therapy for Monday. That is not what happened. My mind raced, the loan I'd taken for the venue, my parents' begrudging contributions coupled with monthly reminders not to waste their money, relatives who'd flown halfway across the country, the stack of gifts already piled high in the lobby. Something inside me snapped. It was reckless, yes, but also disturbingly clear. Humiliation was a scorching wave, but beneath it, a sharp, cold anger ignited. He got to walk away with the text while I was left holding the bill, the dress, the entire damn circus. When Sarah stepped out to speak with the coordinator, I drifted down the hallway like a ghost. I wasn't really seeing anything until I nearly collided with him. It was Ethan, Justin's best friend, his college roommate. The guy who for years had been subtly, almost unconsciously protective of me. The one who'd always walked me to my car after group dinners, who'd text to make sure I got home safe. He was leaning against a wall near the back entrance, adjusting his tie, utterly oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated in my world. He looked up, his smile automatic, polite, before it faltered, morphing into genuine concern as he saw my face, my phone still clutched in my hand. He asked. I just laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It probably sounded like a hyena. Without a word, I handed him my phone, watching his eyes scan the screen. His jaw tightened in that familiar way I'd seen when Justin crossed the line, but this time it went deeper. His entire body tensed. He whispered a curse under his breath, asking when the message had come. When I told him minutes ago, he ran a hand through his hair, looking like he desperately wanted to punch a wall. In that chaotic moment, I had a flash of clarity. Of all the people in that building, Ethan was probably the only one who truly knew Justin's worst sides and had, in his own quiet way, tried to warn me when public betrayal hits you that hard, your brain stops following the normal script. You grasp for any semblance of control. I heard myself ask almost casually if he'd known this was coming. He immediately said no, that if he'd even suspected, he would have told me, dragged Justin here himself. He kept repeating how sorry he was, how I didn't deserve this, how he'd never liked the way Justin talked about getting his life back after the wedding or about money. Something clicked, all those tiny flashes of discomfort on his face over the years. I'd ignored them. Maybe it was the dress. Maybe the adrenaline. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But I looked at him and, with startling calm, said, I wasn't going. Angie to be the pathetic bride left at the altar by text, whispered about for years. I wasn't going to let one coward ruin the ceremony, the food, the music, the flowers, the entire evening. The words tumbled out before I could fully process them, but once they hung in the air, I couldn't pull them back. If Justin didn't want to stand at the front of that room with me, someone else could. Then I asked him, right there in the chaos. I asked if he had feelings for me beyond friendship, because I'd seen the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and I was tired of pretending I hadn't noticed. His face went pale as if I'd ripped open a door he'd been propping shut for years. He tried to deflect, stammering that this wasn't the time, that I was in shock, that I'd regret any decision made in this mess. I shot back that I already regretted spending years with someone who could cancel our wedding with a paragraph, so my bar for regret was pretty damn high. Finally, his voice barely a whisper, he admitted it. Yes, he'd been in love with me for a long time. He'd tried to bury it, hated himself for not telling me sooner, especially as he started seeing how transactional Justin was about our marriage. I stood there, in my wedding dress, staring at him. The sheer ridiculousness almost made me laugh again. Here I was, a bride without a groom, offering myself a replacement, like I was swapping out a broken part. But inside, it didn't feel like that. It felt like choosing to control my own narrative, even in Justin's absence. I told Ethan I wanted to walk down that aisle not out of desperation to be married to anyone, but because I refused to be the girl everyone remembered for collapsing and canceling everything in front of 150 people. I asked if he would stand up there with me, not as a legal husband, but as someone willing to promise to be there while I tried to rebuild whatever came next. He hesitated, the war behind his eyes palpable. He said it was insane, that people would think we'd planned it, that it would look like betrayal on top of betrayal. But then he added that he'd never seen me look so certain. He admitted trying to warn me about Justin over the years, but I'd always shut him down, unwilling to hear anything that didn't fit the perfect fiancé image in my head. He felt guilty for not pushing harder, for suspecting things about money and shady behavior, but not acting. I told him I wasn't asking him to save me. I was asking him to stand next to me so I didn't have to face our friends and family alone, abandoned like a forgotten package. We could figure out the legal stuff, the relationship, all of it later. Right now, I just needed someone who was actually willing to be there. He nodded, slowly, like a man signing a contract he'd written for himself. If you're truly sure, he said, if this is coming from a place of self-respect and not pure revenge, I'll stand with you. Walking toward the ceremony room felt like marching into a storm I'd deliberately chosen. Sarah met us halfway, her eyes wide, questions forming on her face. I gave her the fastest, most chaotic summary possible. She stared at me partly as if I'd lost my mind, but also as if she understood why. If you're gonna do this, Chloe, she said, you own it with your whole chest. No apologizing, no shrinking. She squeezed my hand. I've got your back, even if we both end up as the cautionary tale people whisper about for the next decade. Before anyone could be seated, I walked into the cocktail area. I asked the DJ to cut the music. The groom, I announced, my voice trembling slightly, just texted to say he's not coming. I added that I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine, and if anyone wanted to leave, I completely understood. There was this long, agonizing minute of silence. Then Justin's entire family stood up and walked out, followed by a significant chunk of other guests who clearly wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. The people who stayed, though, they stayed on purpose, and that detail even now matters more than any photograph from that day. When the ceremony room doors opened, I could feel Tet. He airshifted as every head turned. The music, still playing, felt bizarrely mismatched to the moment, but there was no time to change it. So there I was, walking toward the front with Ethan, my almost husband, now suddenly my partner, standing where Justin was supposed to be. My parents' eyes hit me like lasers. My mother's mouth was a tight, disapproving line. My father whispered something to her that made her eyes widen further. And on the left side, where Justin's family had been, was a block of empty chairs, screaming louder than any shouts. I took the microphone, my voice shaking at first, then growing steadier. I reiterated that the groom wasn't coming. I didn't read his text aloud, partly because I wouldn't give him that power, Partly because I didn't trust myself not to choke on the words, I told everyone I wasn't asking them to go home. The food was paid for, the music was ready, people had traveled. I refused to let one person's cowardice ruin the entire night. Then I said the man standing next to me had chosen to step up. We would have a symbolic ceremony instead, a promise between two people to support each other through whatever ridiculous hurricane this decision would cause. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room, the low hum of people scenting fresh gossip. Someone shouted that it was a stunt, that I must have planned it. Others chimed in with accusations, quickly drowned out by shushing and pleas to let us speak. The friend performing the ceremony, after a quick whispered explanation from me, clarified that what we were doing had no immediate legal power, no filings, no technical marriage, just a public commitment. That calmed some, but enraged others. The lack of legal paperwork somehow made it more dramatic, like we were performing our emotional train wreck for entertainment. Some guests nodded in support, others shook their heads in disbelief. A few more walked out, muttering words like crazy and desperate. We went through the motions with a bizarre mix of sincerity and surreal awareness. When it came time for vows, I didn't talk about forever or destiny. I talked about choosing not to disappear, not to be disposable, just because someone else decided I was. I said Ethan had seen me at my absolute lowest in this exact moment and still chose to stand beside me, and that counted for more than promises made in comfortable times. He spoke too, his voice low and a little rough. He admitted he'd been a coward for too long, watching from the sidelines while Justin turned our relationship into a financial plan. He was done being silent, even if stepping up made him look like the villain in some people's eyes. By the time we exchanged symbolic rings, the room had fractured. There were the clappers and eye wipers who loved draft, ma, but also genuinely cared. Then the tight faced, judgmental stares, mentally drafting their own scandalous version of events. And finally, the empty chairs, the ones who'd left. Those hurt more than I expected, each empty seat a choice for Justin's absence over my desperate attempt at dignity. The reception felt like navigating a minefield in heels. Every table was a different vibe. Some hugged me, whispering about my bravery, how they never would have had the courage. Others pulled me aside, suggesting I should have just gone home, licked my wounds privately instead of dragging everyone into this twisted alternate ending. My parents took turns with tight smiles, asking if I was sure, if I'd lost my mind, if this was about love or just money already spent. I could practically see my mother calculating how she'd spin this, positioning herself as the victim of my chaos. Ethan, my new partner for the night, though boyfriend felt too small for what we'd just done, stayed close but maintained an uneasy distance, as if still wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. We danced once, awkwardly, because people expected it. I could feel him tense when he caught someone's phone pointed at us. He kept reminding me we could backtrack legally, that nothing was filed, that if I woke up tomorrow and decided this was a grief response, we could reset to friendship or whatever. Our version of friendship was left after sharing vows in front of families. Much later, when most older relatives had left and only younger friends lingered, Ethan pulled me into a side room. His face told me he'd been holding something in all night. He pulled out his phone, scrolled, then handed it to me like a lit match. Screenshots, messages with Justin, group chats, late night conversations where they talked about me completely unaware they were leaving a paper trail. I read lines about getting through 2 years for a solid settlement, jokes about marrying a walking savings account, comments about how Justin's ex, the needy musician, made him feel alive while I would simply make sure the bills got paid. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I'd vomit. Ethan explained he'd started saving those messages months ago, when he realized Justin wasn't just venting but actively outlining a plan, manipulating prenups, ensuring certain assets stayed in his name, mentioning debts I knew nothing about. He admitted he hadn't saved everything, feeling wrong snooping, but the parts he kept were the ones that made his skin crawl. He tried, in his own way, to warn me with questions and comments. But every time he got too close, I'd shut him down, accusing him of jealousy or paranoia. We ended up in the hotel suite meant for my wedding night, sitting on the edge of the bed, the perfectly arranged rose petals feeling like they belonged to someone else's life. Ethan asked if I wanted him to delete the messages. I told him to send them to me instead. I wanted the receipts. Not necessarily to post them publicly, not yet, but because I needed to know I wasn't crazy for what I was feeling. My phone buzzed endlessly as the screenshots poured in. In between, messages from Justin started popping up from a new number. Long paragraphs about panic, family pressure, how he'd made a mistake, and wanted to talk. I didn't respond. I watched the notifications stack up, then turned my phone face down. We talked until dawn instead, about who we were outside of Justin, how we'd gotten here, and whether anything real could possibly grow out of this mess, or if we were just trauma bonded. I admitted I was partly using him as a shield from humiliation. He admitted he was partly using me as proof that he wasn't as passive as he'd always been. It wasn't romantic or cute. It was raw, honest, and terrifying. Exhausted, still in my dress, I eventually fell asleep, my head on his shoulder, the taste of cake and bitterness still in my mouth. The next morning, the wedding coordinator knocked, a tight, professional smile on her face, asking about checkout times and leftover decorations. It felt absurd to discuss centerpieces when my entire relationship status had flipped in. Less than a day, Ethan and I looked at each other across the room, both with that shell shocked expression you get after a car crash, and we both started laughing, the kind that sounds suspiciously close to crying. We decided to still go on the honeymoon. I know, it sounds insane, but the flights and hotel were paid for with a loan in my name. Canceling wouldn't magically put the money back, and the thought of sitting home fielding calls from relatives and neighbors made me physically ill. My parents were furious, of course. My mother called to say it was inappropriate, that I was disrespecting the seriousness of what had happened. I calmly reminded her that the man who disrespected the seriousness of it was the one who skipped town after texting me, not the one who stayed and faced the fallout right beside me. On the flight, I mostly stared out the window, pretending we were just two random people on vacation. Ethan kept checking on me, asking if I was eating, if I felt okay, if I wanted to talk, or just sit in silence. We settled somewhere in between, narrating small, stupid things. How weird it felt to still wear our reception wristbands. How my hair still smelled like hairspray and stress. There were moments of quiet, the heavy, unspoken question hovering. What are we going to be after this trip when real life crashes back? The week away wasn't a magical reset. We argued more than I expected, mostly about our story to the outside world. He wanted to make things official quickly, not just emotionally, but legally, to prove we were serious. He said real commitment would stabilize everything, especially if Justin escalated his drama. I pushed back hard. My original plan was to marry someone who plotted to use me for money. I wasn't making another giant legal decision just to prove a point on social media. In between arguments, we tackled the practical mess Justin had left. One afternoon in the hotel room, Ethan pulled out more bank statements and screenshots. Transfers from the joint account Justin had convinced me to open to practice managing money together. There were withdrawals for rent, transfers marked as loans, expensive purchases that never showed up at our apartment. My gut clenched. The timing lined up perfectly with crisis posts Justin's ex used to make about eviction. I logged into the account myself, scrolling through statements, my chest tightening with every line. There it was, plain as day. Chunks of money leaving, sometimes just before he'd tell me he couldn't cover his share of utilities. He'd been covering someone else's life with my savings, then making me feel unstable for worrying about our finances. It was like finding a second betrayal tucked neatly inside the first. I cried, then ugly, hiccuping sobs, trying to smother them in a pillow. Ethan sat beside me, helpless, wanting to fix it, but knowing he couldn't. By the end of that week, we made a decision that felt both responsible and unsatisfying. No legal paperwork yet. No courthouse, no license, no name changes. We'd go home as whatever we were, something between best friends and partners, and see if anything stable could be built once the dust settled. It was strange, making such a grown up decision while sharing a hotel bed with someone who knew what my ex had called me behind my back. But deep down, we both knew that rushing into a legal marriage out of fear and pride would only lead to resentment. And I was exhausted from being tied to men through resentment. Back home, reality hit faster than jet lag. I couldn't stay in the apartment Justin and I had shared. Too many memories, his energy still lingering. Ethan and I found a smaller place across town, one bedroom for us, and space for a nursery. Moving felt like shedding skin. Justin, who had spent the honeymoon week sending me walls of texts, switched tactics when I didn't respond. The messages became shorter, more aggressive, and morphed into vague social media posts about betrayal and loyalty. Mutual friends started sending me screenshots, asking what was going on, if it was true I'd run off with his best friend, if I'd made up the text. I finally agreed to meet him at a cough. E-shop we used to frequent, public staff view us a safety blanket. I arrived early, ordered a drink I barely touched, my printed screenshots tucked in a folder in my bag. When he walked in, my body tensed, an automatic muscle memory like leaning in for a kiss. Seeing him in person after everything almost shattered my resolve. He looked exactly the same. It felt obscene. Not a villain, not a mastermind, just a tired man in a nice shirt, oblivious to the damage he'd caused. He started talking before he even sat down, spilling excuses about panic attacks, cold feet, feeling suffocated by wedding expectations. He said his therapist, who I hadn't known about, told him he needed to be honest and canceling last minute would hurt less than divorcing later. I listened without interrupting for longer than I thought possible, letting him dig his own hole. Then I slid the folder across the table. Read, I said. Watching his face as he took in the messages and bank statements was like watching a mask crack. He tried to play it off as dark humor, men vent in gross ways they don't mean. When I pointed out the exact dates the money left the account, aligning with his ex's public crises, the gifts and debt payments matching his own words, his voice began to shake. He tried to grab my hand. I pulled away, not with dramatic flair, but with an exhausted gesture that said, I'm Finnell. I done being handled. I told him I was pursuing legal options to get back what he'd taken, that I'd spoken to a lawyer, that the evidence was saved. I didn't care about his apologies, his mental health claims, his upbringing. None of it changed the fact that he'd turned me into an investment strategy. He accused me of setting him up, of keeping the messages. I genuinely laughed. The irony of him screaming about privacy after weaponizing our entire relationship financially for coffee shop felt like walking out of a courtroom. I wasn't triumphant or vindicated. I was drained, like my bones were heavy. I paid for both our drinks, not to be kind, but for the symbolism. I refused to let him spin a story about me leaving him stranded with the bill, literally or metaphorically. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at my reflection, barely recognizing the woman looking back. If the story ended there, it would have been messy but simple. But Justin didn't know how to leave anything alone. Within days, more vague accusations on his profile, then the video. A friend sent it to me, warning me to sit down. For almost an hour, he told his version in a calm, mournful tone, sounding like a wounded hero. He painted me as controlling, money obsessed, implying I'd emotionally abused him. He hinted my new relationship had started long before. He never mentioned the text, T-message. He glossed over financials as private matters and dismissed the plotting as stupid things friends say when stressed. The comment section was a war zone. Some defended him fiercely, others called him out, asking for proof, reminding everyone the text cancellation was proof enough of his character. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew at work things got awkward. I was an account manager. My job relied on trust. Justin tried calling my main line, then emailing my work address, then messaging colleagues on LinkedIn, asking them to convince me to talk. Harassment, but the cowardly kind. My supervisor finally called me in. She used sympathetic language, but the message was clear. The promotion I was in line for would be delayed until things settled down. That phrase made me want to scream. Nothing in my reality had any intention of settling. I filed my first police report, hands shaking, answering questions about past behavior. The officer, patient but overworked, explained restraining orders in a flat tone that made me feel like just another file. It took weeks for even a temporary order. In that time, Justin hovered like a ghost. In the middle of all this, Ethan and I had our first real blow up. He wanted to go nuclear publicly, release all the receipts, call out every lie. I wanted to pick my battles, maintain some privacy, let the lawyer handle the legal angles while I clung to my job and sanity. We yelled, said things that sounded like accusations even when they were fears. Both of us were stretched so thin a few weeks after that ridiculous symbolic ceremony. Because the universe has a messed up sense of timing, I found out I was pregnant. Only a few weeks along, but I felt like I'd been carrying the weight of it already. Sitting in that medical office, my brain ping-ponged between excitement and terror. When I told Ethan that night, he looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. He quickly caught himself, tried to smile, said he loved me and wanted this, but I saw the fear in his eyes. We were barely stable as a couple in the middle of a public scandal and now a baby. His instinct was to fix it by locking everything down. He brought up marriage again, with even more urgency. He didn't want our child to grow up in a story where people doubted their family or whispered about timelines. He started talking about insurance, legal rights, security, that practical way so easily confused with love. I pushed back, harder this time. I refused to drag a child into a commitment made out of panic. The argument that followed was one of our ugliest. He accused me of stubbornness, of trying to prove I couldn't be controlled. I accused him of wanting to erase his guilt about betraying his friend by turning our mess into a fairy tale. We did go to a lawyer together, though we needed to. The financial mess Justin left wasn't cleaning itself up. The lawyer, a tired-looking woman who'd seen too much family drama, listened without much reaction. She asked pointed questions, took notes, told us what would be easy, what would be a nightmare. We had a decent shot at recovering a portion, she said, especially with documentation, but it wouldn't be quick. We needed to brace for hearings, delays, reopening wounds. His video, meanwhile, kept circulating. Not viral massive, but in our town, on local gossip pages. It might as well have. Strangers recognized me in stores, at the gym, at the park. Some sympathetic, some gleeful, some guessing if my baby bump was his or Ethan's. I tried to stay off social media, but screenshots kept coming, convinced I needed to know who was on our side. At some point, we realized silence wasn't working. The lawyer advised keeping things measured, but also said letting his story be the only public version wasn't helping, so we posted our own statement. Shorter, less dramatic. Just a picture of the text message where he canceled and a brief caption explaining he'd left me minutes before the ceremony, that the best friend stepped in only after, that the financial issues were real and being addressed legally. We didn't drag his mental health. We didn't spill every painful tale, just enough truth to show his version was, at best, selective. The reaction was exactly as expected. Believers felt vindicated. His worshippers accused me of faking screenshots, doctoring timestamps, being manipulative. A decent chunk landed in the middle, shrugging, deciding everyone involved was messy and equally guilty. It was weirdly freeing to realize no amount of proof would convince some people. Once you accept that a percentage of the crowd is committed to misunderstanding you, you stop wasting energy trying to win them over. Meanwhile, the legal process crept along. The restraining order finally went through after hearings where I sat 10 feet from Justin while he acted baffled that I felt unsafe. The judge granted it. For a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe without checking every car that drove past. That peace lasted until the night the front desk called. An envelope. A handwritten letter from him, several pages long, apologizing and justifying in equal measure, ending with a request for a loan because he was out of work. I didn't answer. I gave the letter to my lawyer as evidence of his continued boundary issues. Emotionally, it messed with me. Part of me remembered the man I'd loved. The one who brought soup when I was sick, who talked about stupid movies late into the night. Knowing that version, and the man who turned me into a financial exit plan, were the same person, made my brain feel like static. About 2 months later, Sarah called, her voice bracing for impact. She said Justin had been hospitalized after what his family called a breakdown. They'd found him in their basement, half catatonic, surrounded by bills, empty bottles, and a laptop open to comment sections he shouldn't have been reading. He was checked into a psychiatric program. His mother left a voicemail, crying, begging me to visit, saying it might help him stabilize, that he was talking about me nonstop. I wrestled with that for days. Ethan, who had once wanted to set Justin's phone on fire, seemed shaken by the news too. He'd lost a friend, however toxic. We debated whether seeing him would be healing or harmful. My therapist, who I was finally seeing regularly, told me to decide based on my mental health, not some imagined responsibility to provide closure for a man who'd blown up my life. I ran it by my lawyer first. We arranged the visit, ensuring it wouldn't violate the order. In the end, we went. I won't pretend it was noble. It was a mixture of curiosity, guilt, fear, and a stubborn desire to look him in the eye one last time in a controlled environment. The clinic was quiet, smelling of antiseptic and cheap coffee. When he walked into the visitor room, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but energetically. His eyes were dull from medication. He smiled when he saw me, then froze when he noticed Ethan sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly on my knee. Justin started apologizing almost immediately. Childhood trauma, pressure, feeling trapped, hating himself. He was ashamed of the video, said he'd been in a bad place. He cried, not pretty crying, messy and hard to watch. For a second, my heart tried to soften. Empathy is a stubborn thing. But then he started wrapping his apologies around little barbs. He never would have snapped if I hadn't pushed so hard for the wedding, if I hadn't been so focused on every detail, if his friend hadn't taken advantage. That was my line. I realized he still saw himself as the main victim. Yes, he was hurting, clearly unwell, but buried in every sorry was a hidden accusation that someone else had pushed the first domino. I told him I hoped he got the help he needed, that I didn't wish him harm, but whatever connection we had was over. Not just romantically, but in every possible form. Then I got up and left, Ethan following silently. In the parking lot, we stood for a long moment, staring at the building, feeling the weight of 10 years of intertwined lives finally loosen a little. Life didn't magically become peaceful, but the drama shifted from explosive events to slow, grinding repairs. The civil case about the money moved forward in fits and starts. Hearings, delays, more paperwork than I thought possible for a simple concept. He took my money, I wanted it back. My job stabilized. Some clients bailed when gossip was hottest, but others stuck around either because they didn't care or they recognized a fellow human disaster. I worked hard, not just at being competent, but at being professionally boring, so my name would eventually be associated with reliable deliverables, not dramatic stories. At home, we tried to build a normal routine. The pregnancy forced discipline onto our chaos. Doctor appointments, budgeting, childcare conversations instead of just lawyers and rumors. We still fought, sometimes loudly, sometimes about old wounds. Ethan struggled with guilt about his role, worried our child would hear their father was best friends with the man who hurt their mother. I struggled with trust, wondering if I was capable of choosing partners who didn't secretly see me as a ladder or shield. About 7 months after that ridiculous symbolic ceremony, because the universe has a messed up sense of timing, we did finally get legally married. I was about 7 months pregnant. No grand romantic gesture. We were at the county office dealing with paperwork for insurance and hospital pre registration. At some point, we looked at each other and realized that emotion. Ally, we'd already chosen each other in all the ways that mattered. The legal part was just catching up. We stood in a small, bland room with a clerk, said the simplest vows, signed our names, and walked out married in a way that felt strangely more solid than the elaborate performance had ever promised. Our daughter was born 2 months later, a little early, after stressful weeks with uncooperative blood pressure. The labor was long, messy, and absolutely not cinematic. When she finally came out, tiny but loud, something in my chest shifted again. Holding her, I felt both more fragile and more grounded than I had in years. Justin sent a short message through his lawyer after hearing the news, a sentence congratulating us and wishing the baby health. It was the first communication from him that didn't try to rewrite history or tug on guilt. Honestly, that was a relief. The civil case eventually settled. He agreed to pay back $12,000 over 3 years, roughly half what he'd taken. After attorney fees and taxes, the amount we actually saw was almost symbolic. For a while, that infuriated me. I wanted the money, yes, but I wanted the principle of it to feel bigger. Over time, I realized what mattered more was the official acknowledgement that he had done something wrong, something requiring restitution. It was a line in a document that said, I had not imagined the whole thing. 3 years after our daughter was born, she was running around a park on a sunny afternoon when I heard a familiar voice say my name. I turned. There he was, sitting on a bench, looking worn out but steadier somehow. He stood up, hands visible and empty, as if to show he meant no trouble. My husband, Ethan, because it still feels strange sometimes to use that word about the man who once stood at the altar as a stand in, moved closer, instinctively, not aggressive, but clearly protective. Justin told us he'd moved back to town a few months earlier for a job in a small accounting office. I asked if his family knew. He shook his head. They barely spoke anymore, he said, blaming him for the embarrassment, the hospital stays, the financial mess. His mother had sent one card after he got out of the program, then nothing. He was still in therapy, still on medication, still working through his mess. He looked at our daughter, who'd wandered over, and his face softened in a way that was complicated to watch. He said she was beautiful, then quickly corrected himself, hoping it wasn't overstepping. He didn't ask to hold her or for pictures. He just nodded and said he finally understood what he'd thrown away. Not just a relationship, but an entire possible life. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. It was civil, awkward, full of small silences. When he walked away, I didn't feel the rusho and anger or the painful squeeze of nostalgia I'd expected. Mostly, I felt tired and weirdly indifferent. It was like my brain had finally filed him under past instead of keeping him in the active threats folder. Later that night, lying in bed with Ethan, snoring softly, our daughter's monitor buzzing, I realized that indifference was probably the closest thing to peace I was ever going to get from that situation. What almost nobody ever asks about, though, is the part in the middle. The boring looking years that weren't actually boring at all. The stretch of time where we had to turn this wild origin story into something that worked on a random Tuesday night. When the trash needed to go out and the baby wouldn't sleep. After the settlement was signed and the legal emails slowly stopped, there was this strange quiet that didn't feel peaceful at first. It felt like when a loud appliance finally turns off and your ears are still ringing. I kept waiting for another message, another post, another twist, because my nervous system had gotten so used to constant alerts that normal days almost felt wrong. There were mornings when I'd wake up already braced for impact, only to realize the only thing on my schedule was a staff meeting and a prenatal checkup. I didn't quite know what to do with that kind of calm. My relationship with my parents didn't magically transform either. For a long time, my mother told her version of the story, making herself the long suffering parent of a reckless daughter who collected scandals like other people collected mugs. She'd tell people I'd been through a lot, that my heart was too big, that I was impulsive. And she'd somehow always forget to mention that the man who abandoned me had also drained my savings while still asking if I really needed therapy or if I was just tired. At first, I tried to correct her every time to jump in with the factual version, but that turned every family gathering into a debate club. Eventually, I just stopped arguing and limited the audience. If someone genuinely wanted to know, I told them myself, over coffee without her narration. There were also the small, unglamorous victories I don't put in the headlines. Like the first time Ethan and I got through a big argument without threatening to leave. Or the first time we paid a bill from a savings account that wasn't tied to Justin in any way. We went to therapy, separately and together, not because we were on the verge of breaking up, but because we both knew our foundation had been poured in a storm. The therapist made us talk about things we'd been avoiding, like the fact that the day Ethan said yes at the altar was also the day he finally stopped avoiding his own feelings, and that came with a guilt he didn't know where to put. Sheepo. To have my habit of bracing for abandonment, even when he was just running late, and at his habit of overcompensating with big gestures whenever he felt even a little bit like the bad guy. Work changed too. After a while, I realized that no matter how competent I was, there would always be colleagues at that first company who secretly saw me as the messy one, the woman from the wedding video and the ex drama. It wasn't even malicious most of the time, just one more label stuck to my name, so I quietly started sending out resumes, not frantically, but with that slow, steady determination you have when you're ready for a new chapter. When I finally switched to a different firm, one where almost nobody knew my personal history, it felt like stepping into a room without a spotlight on my back. Within a year, I made senior account manager, a position equivalent to the promotion I'd lost. This time, my advancement was based solely on my work, not anyone's perception of my personal drama. I still disclosed the basics to my new manager, but it was different telling the story as past context instead of the latest episode of my current life. Our daughter grew from a tiny bundle into this loud, opinionated little person who has no idea how complicated her origin story is. To her, the world is simple. She knows her parents met at a wedding, and there was a mix up with the original P. Lan, the only way we can make it sound funny instead of tragic when she asks why there are pictures of her father in the wedding album, even though the grown ups keep joking about a missing groom. She loves the photo of me in the big dress, twirling her around in our tiny living room many months later, more than any picture from the actual reception. When she runs around the house wearing a towel as a cape, yelling that she's saving the day, I sometimes have to bite back a weird laugh because part of me still wants to argue that what I did back then wasn't exactly saving the day, even if people tell it that way now. We did end up doing a small vow renewal later once the dust had truly settled and life looked almost normal. It wasn't a grand production, just a simple ceremony in a backyard with a rented arch and a playlist made on a random streaming app. Only the people who had stood by us through the worst were invited. Sarah, the one who saw the text on my wedding day with her own eyes, made a toast that was equal parts roast and love letter. She talked about how sometimes people burn the script because they're done being written as the side character in their own life. I could feel my mother physically cringe when she realized that line was aimed at her favorite narrative. The vow renewal wasn't about rewriting history or pretending the original chaos hadn't happened. It was more like saying, okay, we did this wild thing for all the wrong reasons and some right ones. And instead of pretending it was a fairy tale, we are going to own how messy it was and still choose each other on a regular Tuesday with no audience and no drama. Our daughter walked very seriously down the makeshift aisle, holding a tiny pillow with two simple rings, taking the job so seriously that she shushed my cousin for whispering. Justin was nowhere near that day, not in person, and not as a topic. And that absence finally felt like a neutral fact instead of a jagged gap. Every once in a while, some distant acquaintance will bring up the old video or the screenshots, like they're referencing an episode of a show I starred in. They'll say something like, I remember when all that happened. You were so strong. And I have to resist the urge to correct them and say that strength isn't really the word for what I was. I was cornered, angry, heartbroken, stubborn, and yes, maybe a little grave, but it didn't feel heroic. It felt very human. The real strength, if there was any, showed up later. In the months where there were no cameras, no gossip pages, just bills and crying and uncomfortable conversations about trust and pride. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm sitting at the kitchen table with a lukewarm drink, I still replay certain scenes. I won. Dare how different everything would be if I'd made one small choice differently. If I'd canceled the wedding politely and gone home. If I'd listened to Ethan's quiet warnings and actually looked at the numbers. If I'd stayed single for a while instead of stepping straight into another relationship under the brightest spotlight imaginable. There are versions of my life where I avoided some of the pain, where my reputation was cleaner, where fewer people felt entitled to an opinion. There are also versions where I stayed with a man who quietly saw me as a credit line instead of a partner. None of those hypothetical lives come with a guarantee of less heartbreak. They just come with different headlines. The funny thing is, the more time passes, the less I feel the need to defend every detail. In the beginning, I wanted everyone to understand exactly why I did what I did, to see each text and statement and court paper, to weigh the facts and declare a verdict. Now, I mostly just want my little family to stay intact and reasonably healthy. I still find myself explaining it sometimes, especially when a new friend finally asks why my wedding photos look slightly off if they stare long enough. But it no longer feels like I'm on trial. It feels more like I'm describing a strange storm that blew through my life for a long stretch and then eventually moved on. Years later, when people, hey, are the condensed version of my story, they tend to focus on the wedding day twist. They love the part where I walk down the aisle with someone else, where I refuse to be publicly humiliated, where I turn chaos into some half romantic, half unhinged move. They don't always want to hear about the months of legal paperwork, the nights of anxiety, the arguments, the therapy sessions, the awkward school events where I still occasionally catch someone whispering. They want the headline, not the footnotes. But when I sit on my couch at night and think about everything, it's the footnotes that feel the most real. The way Sarah stayed even when she disagreed, but knew I needed someone in my corner. The way my parents, as judgmental as they were at first, eventually babysat so we could go to court without bringing a toddler. The way Ethan and I learned to fight without turning each other into enemies, to apologize without keeping score, to build something that didn't rely on pretending our origin story wasn't a complete mess. If you had told me that morning when I first looked at my phone and saw those few cruel sentences that this was where I would end up, I probably would have laughed in your face and then burst into tears. I used to think stability came from making all the right choices in the right order. Now, I know it sometimes comes from making the most honest choice available in a terrible moment and then dealing with the consequences one day at a time. I'm not proud of every decision I made. And I'm sure there are people out there who still tell my story in a version where I'm the villain. That's fine. They weren't the ones who had to live it. I tell you all of this not because I think anyone should copy what I did, but because I refuse to be reduced to that girl who got dumped by text and either collapsed or turned into a meme. I was humiliated. Yes. I was also angry, impulsive, stubborn, reckless, and sometimes brave in ways that didn't look pretty. I blew up my own life in order to avoid being quietly erased from it. In the end, I got something that looks suspiciously like a family out of the wreckage. But it's not a reward or proof that I did everything right. It's just the life that grew out of all those imperfect choices. And for better or worse, it's mine to live with every single day. So if you've ever had your life completely upended, or if you've been in a situation where you had to rewrite your own story on the fly, I want to hear from you. What choices did you make when the script got tossed out the window? Let me know in the comments below.